So I'll be talking about some of the same people in the same times as we've just heard about, but in a very different way, because I'm neither a statistician nor a historian. I'm a journalist, which means that I learn just enough about something to write my article and then promptly forget it because I'm thinking about my next article. And the article in question you all have a copy of. It's from our Christmas issue 2 Christmases ago. I had to read it again myself before coming along and get out my notes. I had wanted to write this article for some years, and because I used to edit the magazine of the Royal Statistical Society's Significance, and I trained as a mathematician myself, a pure mathematician, and then when I got the job here at the RSS, I was completely astounded to discover that a lot of the foundational figures, the people I had heard about in my undergraduate degree, in which I had done some statistical courses, were still with us. And it was like Newton walked among us still, as far as I was concerned, to discover that David Cox was actually someone you could meet, that you could say hello to him and he was there, So I got very interested in that, and then I heard of SR17, and again and again at meetings when we talked about people we would interview for Significance, people would mention SR17 and they'd mention the Second World War. So I had got interested in this idea that the war had some seminal or sort of catalytic, that's the right word, catalytic effect on the discipline of statistics. I had not known that, and from talking to other people, I discovered nobody knew that really. So the code breaking has become a really well-known story from the Second World War, but I still don't think people understand, what happened to statistics. So the way our Christmas issue works, it's a really odd issue. Half of it is a standard issue of The Economist, and the other half is just things that people want to write about, and they can be extremely odd. I mean, I still remember an article several years ago about the history of meat curing, which struck me 3 pages on that was really a bit of a stretch as far as I was concerned. But anyway, so I looked this morning to see the email I sent to pitch the article, and actually I feel that I did deliver what I said I was going to do. So I said I'd like to write about some of the great British statisticians, great in the sense of shaping the very foundations of the discipline and not just its developments in the past 60 years, whose statistical formation came during the Second World War. Not everyone knows about the SR17, the research group inside the Ministry of Supply, the Royal Aircraft Establishment and Rothamsted were also very important. Statistics as a discipline is remarkably recent, really a 20th century construct, unlike mathematics, which was being done seriously BC, or even probability, which was being done seriously by the 1800s. Clever youngsters who were admitted to mathematics degrees during the war were allowed to go to university for 2 years before going either to the front or into war-related research, depending on how promising they were. Some went on to physics, some to maths, but lots were funneled to industrial statistics, supply chains, crop improvement, quality control, and even decisions about when and where to target bombing raids. For reasons unclear to me, statisticians seem to be remarkably long-lived. Quite a few of those forged during that period and given a lifelong field of study by the research they were directed into are not only still alive, but impressively active and intellectually sharp. I would talk to a few of them and do the piece as a combination of profile of 1 or 2 of those people and the extraordinary start their careers took, the way the needs of war shaped not only their lives, but that of the discipline ever since, in these modest institutions where foundational work was being done by youngsters at 20 or 21. So I decided whose stories I would tell. Of course, it was a question of who I could get hold of and who was still alive, and I wanted a bit of variety as well, because I sort of wanted to talk about SR17, but I also wanted to talk about people who were in the army and something outside SR17, just something different. And also the enormous shift that the war made to official statistics, as well as this group of people who worked on mathematical statistics or industrial statistics. So I went for 4 people who were Klaus Moser, David Cox, Peter Armitage, and George Box, who was dead by the time I wrote my article, but had written this lovely, very engaging autobiography called An Accidental Statistician. So I had his war story as written by himself. And I interviewed Eileen, who told me some stuff about, what wars do to people. And I talked to David Spiegelhalter, who was a grandchild, effectively, of that generation. His supervisor's supervisor had been in SR17, and some material from Geoffrey Jowett, who was one of the SR17 alumni, who was by that time living in New Zealand. He died in December. He was severely demented by the time I wrote my article, and his son and daughter said to me how sad they were I hadn't written my article 10 years earlier. I was sad too, actually. I felt that I was just grabbing the last remnants while they were still there. But he had written a very, very nice review article in 1990 for the New Zealand, I think, Statistical Association, in which he talked about SR17 in the war, and that was available to me. So I went and interviewed Klaus at his house in Camden. As I'm sure you all know, he died last September, so I was very glad to see him. I went to Peter's house in Didcot, and I met David Cox at his college in Oxford. So it's a different sort of thing that I was doing than writing an academic article. As I said, I wanted to tell a story, and I'll say a bit more about the story I wanted to tell in a minute, but I was aware I wanted to do several things, and one of them was I wanted to hint at the role of class in the decisions about who went where and who did what. So I think George Box was highly unusual in ending up in statistics because he left school when he was 16. He went to work as an assistant for a chemist in a sewage plant, and that meant that in the war he got sent to Porton Down because they were doing research on chemical gases there, on poison gases, mustard gas in particular. And he was a very clever young man who had sort of read way outside his need to read, and he had tried to read one of Fisher's books. I think he said he had totally failed. But then when they were trying to research how the effects of mustard gas and how you should treat people who've been exposed to mustard gas, he knew enough to know that you needed to do this properly. And he didn't really know what properly was, but I think they were just sort of putting drops of, it's a liquid mustard gas, and then it gives off a gas. They were putting drops of the liquid on people's arms and to see how they healed when you treated them different ways, and I think they were doing it in a totally unsystematic way, and he said to me, you need to do this systematically, and there's a guy called Fisher who does something like this, knows something like this. I tried to read his book once, but I didn't get anywhere, and the answer he got was, well, you tried to read the book, you have to do it. So that was how he became a statistician, effectively. Has everybody here read his autobiography? Has anyone here read his autobiography? You've read it, of course. Absolutely lovely book, and he says that at one point he wrote to Fisher asking him for some help because he couldn't understand something in his book, and by then Fisher was in Cambridge, so he was told to go to Cambridge to meet Fisher, but there was no way a sergeant could go, like just to meet a professor. They had no sort of form for this, so they filled out a form that said that he was bringing a horse there, and that was how he got his railway requisition. So that was one person whose story I told, and it was a very different story from those of Peter and David, Peter Armitage and David Cox, who had both been in Cambridge, had both been, I think, grammar school boys, had both been obviously extremely clever and had been coached to become mathematicians, showed great promise, and both of whom thought they would be doing something mathematical, whether in university or whether as a teacher, and who were then just sent to, in David's case, the RAE, and in Peter Armitage's case, SR17. And that was, as you said, the switch, the moment when somebody who was going one way switched another way. So I discovered, and this is something Eileen and I talked about, how wars, they mix people up and they knock people off one path and onto another. So in lots of films and stories, I guess there are war stories and people tell you about their daring do and, who they met. We talk about things like, war brides or people who are refugees or something, and this was just, I thought, a different sort of war story, that somebody was set on one life path and then they were knocked onto another. So I wanted to get that out in the article. And Klaus, of course, was a different story because he had come with his family as essentially refugees from Germany when they realised that they weren't going to be safe in Germany, and then he was interned when he was 17, and he shouldn't have been interned because they didn't intern under 18s, but he was anyway. And he was in, I'm forgetting the name of it now, Huyton, I think, outside Liverpool. And he was there for a few months only because they did release him when they realised there'd been a glitch with the ages. But in that time, he met a mathematician who had decided, as his thing to do, to keep himself busy in the internment camp, he was going to set up a little statistical office, and he was going to find out who was there, what they knew, collect vital statistics, effectively. And he sat next to him one day at lunchtime, and this guy told him what he was doing and said, I need an assistant, would you like to help? And that was his switch, like going along the railway, the point switch, and your entire life changes course. I wanted to show where people went afterwards as well, because there's a lovely quote from Geoffrey Jowett in this paper he wrote. He said that two things happened to them in SR17. The first, so he had been one of the people you referred to who was trained to teach quality control and then went out to factories to show people how to do quality control. He said, in convincing people, in trying to convince people that we had a good product to sell, we convinced ourselves. And so that was what he felt had happened to him and other people in that group, that they had, in learning statistics, they had taught themselves that statistics mattered. And then that wasn't something they wanted to give up when they left. And then the other thing he said is after the war, SR-17 exploded like a London bomb. There's a great mixed metaphor. Exploded like a London bomb, and we went out in missionary statistical positions all over the country and then the world. So he went to Sheffield, and then he went to Australia, and then he went to New Zealand, and he set up mathematics departments in every place he went. Statistics department in every place he went. So, the influence, as you said, of this couple of years period of this rather small ephemeral group that then just spread out around the world and literally hopped around the place opening statistics departments. Absolutely incredible. Nothing else could have possibly done this. I'm sure that's correct. I also, in the piece, and the reason I'm not just telling you what's in the piece is I've given you all a copy and it's ridiculous for me to tell you what's in it. I want to sort of say why I picked the things I did out. I also wanted to give people some sort of feeling at the end of the article that they would have some idea themselves about what it was that these people were doing, what were the ideas. I mean, obviously in a very sort of straightforward and simple way. So I wanted to get people to understand that one of the things a statistician would do, and that this was not a very long-lived, that this idea hadn't been known for very long before the Second World War, was that people would want to interrogate nature, that they'd want to ask a question, what happens if I do such and such to crops, or what happens if I treat things differently, and how can I work out whether my treatment has made a difference, and how can I unpick that from randomness? So this is Fisher, I think, Fisher and Pearson were the people who started to think about these questions. And what David Cox and both Peter Armitage and David Cox said to me at the time was that although these ideas had been developed by the time of the Second World War, they weren't in common use. People weren't doing quality control in factories. And so they learned these things, and the ones of them who went out were basically, as Geoffrey Jowett said, they were statistical missionaries. And then I wanted to show how after the war, the people who had learnt these things went on into other fields. So some of them went into industrial statistics. George Box went to ICI, for example. Some of them, David Cox went to the Wool Industries Research Association, and Peter Armitage, via a slightly circuitous route, ended up doing medical statistics. He's one of the most important figures in medical statistics. And the idea that he took with him from SR-17 was the idea of sequential testing. So again, I just wanted to explain that in the piece very sort of simply. This sort of really clever but very obvious once somebody says it, idea that if you're trying to see if a process is in control or out of control, if something's going well or going badly, well, it might actually be so good or so bad that you don't have to keep going very long before you can tell that. And that's, of course, how we run medical trials today. You stop them as soon as it's clear that you're actually poisoning people, or indeed that this is so wonderful that you should give it to everybody. And, I mean, I hadn't known that that was something that, had that genesis, or at least that catalyst in SR-17, and I hoped people who read it were also interested. And then there was all this completely other strand about official statistics. So the RSS in 1919 had suggested to the government that they might like to set up some sort of central official statistics body, and they had been told it was not practicable. But then they did it during the war via this Churchill's Special S group. And he said later on, or someone else said of him later on, that he was being driven demented by being given different figures by different departments, and then the departments would argue with each other over important things like shipping tonnage. And he wanted to have one set of figures that was the best set of figures, and that every department had to use these figures without question. I suppose they could question them in the sense they could say that they weren't well enough done, but that they accepted the process, and then they could all talk to each other. And really, I mean, in Barnett and Plackett's list of things that came out of that war, it's an absolutely incredible list. I have it. Where do I have it? I put it in the article, but I mean, I just wrote a short sort of paragraph touching on some of the things that came out of government accounts, the quality of government accounts, running rationing, doing manpower surveys, running the pay-as-you-earn system of taxation, the Beveridge Report on social insurance that led to the founding of the welfare state. All of these things were hugely, if not caused by, at least hugely speeded up or strengthened by the way that official statistics improved during the Second World War. So I said that I had set out to write one sort of story, and I was very interested to hear what you said you wanted to talk about, which was how the war changed statistics. That's exactly what I wrote as well. And I filed it to the woman who edits the Christmas issue, and she came back and she said, that is very interesting, but I want to know what statistics did for the war. And I think you're the same sort of person as me. You know, it's not that I didn't know this about myself, that I was more interested in what the war did for statistics. But, you know, I sort of sat there and thought, God, that's actually really interesting. Of course other people want to know what statistics did for the war. And I sort of had to put in some bits into the piece, because nobody had sort of set out to tell me that, and I hadn't really set out to ask them either. And part of the problem I discovered was that these people were extremely self-effacing. They weren't really willing to tell me about, you know, how they had saved lots of lives, or, you know, whatever, you know, I changed the course of the war or something. I wonder if they really kind of did, but that they were just too modest to say so. So some of the things that people said to me, so David Cox described some of his research as being to do with how much you could load up a plane, like just, you know, without its wings falling off effectively. So there were spot welds in the making of planes, and the question with a spot weld is, if one of them fails, will the rest be able to carry the load or not? And he worked out an answer to this question. And so I said to him, well, you know, what did that lead to? And he got all sort of defensive, because he didn't want to say, well, you know, I guess some people's lives were saved. But I'm sure they were, it's just he didn't want to say it. Peter Armitage was sort of similarly kind of not forthcoming, likewise Klaus. They just didn't want to say, you know, well, this was, you know, absolutely transformative. Yeah, so George Box, actually, one of the stories I tell in the article is George Box describes this trial of mustard gas, and effectively what they found out was, don't put anything on it. They had lots of different ointments that they put on, and what they found out was the best thing that you could do was just to wash it, dress it, and leave it alone. And that's still actually the best that we can do for anyone who's poisoned by mustard gas, sadly. And Klaus Moser had said that he was part of a group that went, after the liberation of Versailles, went onto the continent, and then it would make these top secret visits to places that had been raided and bombing raids, and the aim was to see if what pilots reported they had done in the way of bombing was actually accurate. And again, you know, he just didn't kind of want to say what led to this. He just sort of went, well, I think they were sort of right. They kind of, maybe they boasted a little bit. That was the most he was willing to say. And the other one that David Cox said that they had worked on was they were looking at the pattern of the German bombing on London and trying to work out what it was the Germans were trying to do. And they came to the conclusion that they were trying to bomb the docks, but that they were systematically out a little bit, which I suppose was useful to know, but he then wasn't willing to sort of go from there to say, and this led to these policy outcomes. I think that for all of them, it was the work that mattered, is the point. That the people who ended up becoming the important people in statistics after the war were, of course, the people who fell in love with the work that they were doing. And I'm not saying that they didn't think about the results or want to make a contribution, because that would be absurd, and that is visible. It's visibly absurd from their careers. It's just that they became besotted by the fact that there were these questions, and that they had the tools to interrogate the world and try to find the answers, more than by the answers themselves, if that makes sense. Sorry. One of the things that I thought when I was writing the article, when I was meeting these people, was what were the sort of lessons that this experience of getting these people into war statistical work has? What are the lessons it has for governments, but also for how we train young people? And the obvious lesson, I think, was it tells us that what governments can do when they really want to, which I think was a point that Eileen made as well, that, you know, war is when governments realise that there are things they want to do and that they can do them and they make them happen. And this isn't me just trying to make a dig at any particular government, because after all, we vote for the government, and if they don't do what we want, then we can vote them out. But I wish there was some sort of way that we could you know, get that same sort of urgency about things, little problems like climate change, for example. I mean, I'm sure we can't really without the pressing need for solutions, you know, against an existential threat that's really immediate. But it's incredible when you think, like what was done, that list of, just on the official statistics side, that list of things like the welfare state, PAYE taxation. That was one of the lessons for me about the government side of things. But there was a lesson as well for what we should be doing with young people, and maybe this is less utopian. It struck me that, in ordinary times, young people don't have this sort of random element that was introduced by the war into their decisions about where to go. And it can be very hard for young people to see what they should do, to step out of the world that they were brought up in, to think outside the school subjects that they're good at, or so on. And I was wondering if there was some sort of way that we could try and, add in some less predictable aspects to what people do. I don't know if that's more work experience or gap years or something like that, but it was so clearly these people would never have been in what were very important fields if they hadn't had this experience. I think another lesson from it was that it's important to get young people to do serious and meaningful work as fast as you can. And that was something that all the people I spoke to said, that very quickly they were taken to the edge of what people knew about, even if some of them felt that what they were doing was not not cutting edge. I mean, repeatedly, like David Cox said, the work I was doing was statistically boring, but he knew it was important, and he was in this group that had great camaraderie. It was meaningful. There was a real importance to the work that they were doing, and too often we take a long time to get people early in their careers to do useful things. David Spiegelhalter said to me that one of the most extraordinary, fortuitous things for the development of statistics was that very clever, very abstract thinkers learned very profoundly about industrial processes, and that's not something that often happens. So George Barnard, as we heard, was intending to go into mathematical logic, which is about as abstract as we can get. And David always found very entertaining the fact that after the war, one of the things that he was responsible for was the British standard for the testing of condoms. So the war really sort of brought him from one extreme to the other. There was also the fact that people had to work together. So not only were people mixed up, but they were brought together in a sort of common endeavour. And before the Second World War, statistics was an extraordinarily riven discipline with two very strong, very difficult individuals in their own schools, who didn't talk to each other. And after the war, that didn't seem to happen, even though, if you think about it, statistics has the potential to be a subject of schools in which people virulently snipe at people in other schools. I mean, there's the really rather separate issues of official statistics and in mathematical statistics, but here we are in the same society, and people do talk to each other. Or Bayesians and frequentists, who I do hear say very rude things about each other, but they say it in a sort of a different way than I think they would if there hadn't been that experience of the Second World War. So SR17 in particular was a sort of a bottleneck moment. I mean, not that there had been lots of people beforehand who were gathered together and then sent out, but it just got together all the people who created the discipline in one place, and then they went out, and they always had that experience of having been together and having had a common endeavour afterwards. It's like an evolution. When there's a near extinction event, you can still see it a long time afterwards in the DNA of a species. And then there was an element of good luck, because they were such lovely people. So, I mean, I don't know, George Box and David Cox wrote a paper together some decades afterwards, just for the fun of having the authorship of Box and Cox, which not only sounds funny, but it's actually the name of a farce that was popular in their youth, in which a landlady, an unscrupulous landlady, rents out the same room to two men, one in the daytime and one in the night, because one of them works in the night and one of them in the day. And I haven't seen the farce, but I guess there's all sorts of people nearly walking in on each other sort of stuff. They were just very good-humoured, entertaining people. And in the Barnard and Plackett paper, he describes how they had a chart that they kept records of how punctual people were, and as a sort of statistical exercise. And they had a worshipful order for the unbuttoning of Taylor being one of their number, who was always extremely proper and well dressed, and never had fewer than 3 buttons done up on his jacket. So there's a sort of esprit de corps that was so obvious when you hear them talk about it. The piece finishes with the idea that the collaboration fostered by the war effort between statisticians and industrialists, factory workers, government officials, and researchers in other fields, together with the democratic post-war spirit, turned out self-effacing, intellectually generous types, without whom statistics might have remained a riven discipline, as it had been during Pearson's and Fisher's interwar feud. So I think that's a really important thought. Apart from that, the main thing I can do at this meeting is I printed out the notes of my interviews with the people I talked to. I don't write, very complete notes. They're not something that I can read out, but I just wanted to look through them and sort of, pick out a few things that struck me as particularly noteworthy. The people I spoke, but both David Cox and Peter Armitage talked about the very bizarre experience of trying to pick up their lives again after the war. And they went back to Cambridge to try and finish their mathematics, and they both did. But they had grown up so much. They had been away from home. They'd been in London. They'd been doing important work. Which with them was this, and this is. So Peter Armitage said he'd forgotten all his maths, and also he was in the experience of suddenly being in a classroom again when he had been at the edge of a discipline, and so that was part of why people didn't go back into maths. It was that it just seemed too small for them. Not that it's a small discipline, but that what they would have to do would have felt like a quite big step backwards. So then Peter also told me that when he went on, so he ended up working with Hill, as in Bradford Hill and Dolan Hill, about this idea of sequential testing, and that was where it came into medical trials. And he talked about the opposition that they experienced from doctors and from everyone in the medical profession, because what he said was that they felt that it was unethical to turn to statisticians in deciding what treatments you gave to people, because a doctor is somebody who has a professional role, and that they should be deciding on their professional knowledge, not on some bit of paper or some chart or some numbers. And that took a long time for them to get across that idea. And one of the things they did was that there had been about a half a dozen RCTs already done, and they reanalyzed these RCTs as if they had had sequential methods, and were able to show that they would have stopped earlier, and that they would have given more people, therefore, the right treatments, and that helped. But of course, it just takes time to get that sort of idea out, especially when you're trying to work with people from a very different discipline. People brought up in medicine have their own ideas about how you do things, and I'm sure this still happens now. They don't necessarily appreciate having people from a different discipline come in and tell them that actually there's a rather different way you could frame all of this. I think that it's probable, in my opinion anyway, that the way the RSS is today also is affected by the war experience. So David Cox pointed out to me that the interwar experiences of Karl Pearson and of also of Fisher weren't anything to do with the RSS, which at the time had been all about the government and social side of things. But in the Second World War, people, maybe I think they had to stop thinking in such a compartmentalised way. And I have no idea what the history of it is, like how the RSS became all of the different sorts of branches of statistics, but it seems at least plausible to me that the war played a part in not having, in statistics being still a very interdisciplinary group. I know there's people who work in all the different areas and maybe they don't necessarily collaborate all the time. I just mean this business of these things hanging together. Let's have a look. I very much liked something that David Cox said to me when he went on to talk about the sorts of work that statisticians did after the Second World War. He said, one of the things that you had to explain to people is the whole thing is a fiasco if you try to be too clever. I mean, it's obviously a very funny thing for one of the cleverest people any of us will ever meet to say, but what he was trying to say was that you have to be quite grounded when you're a statistician who's working with people who are trying to run real experiments. Like, you can have this wonderful idea in your head that you'll have 19 or 52 different strands to your experiment, and everything will be very just absolutely optimal, but you've got real people trying to do it, and if you try and do it too fancily, it's just going to mess up. I don't think that anything except the war experience could have made that a thought that was profoundly understood by someone so intellectual. I think this is just to repeat the point that David Spiegelhalter made about some very abstract thinkers understanding industrial processes. And I think that's really all I want to say.